Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar where we'll be taking a look at the Global Environmental Management Initiative's new quick guide on renewable and alternative energy. My name is Stephen Kennett and I look after the Energy and Carbon Management channel here at 2 Degrees. In a moment I'll hand over to Laurie Williams, GEMI's Chair and Business Strategy Advisor at FedEx Corporation, who will introduce today's session. But before we begin, I'd just like to remind everyone that you can submit questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A box on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. Just type in your question and press send, and then we'll wait till the end before answering as many as we can. As an aside, if you should have any technical issues during the webinar, please use the chat box on the right-hand side to send me a message, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. So without any further delay, I'd like to hand over to Laurie, who'll get us started with today's webinar. So over to you, Laurie.
Thank you, Stephen. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the GEMI Quick Guide to Renewable and Alternative Energy. As Stephen said, I'm Laurie Williams, the 2014 GEMI Chair, and today with me I have Bob Toy from Union Pacific, our Communications Chair and the mastermind behind the Quick Guides, Steve Scarda from Procter & Gamble, the co-chair of our Climate Change and Renewable Energy Network and the leader of this Quick Guide team, and Steve Hellam, GEMI's Executive Director. We'd like to thank you for your interest in the GEMI Quick Guides and appreciate you making time in your schedule to learn more about the first tool in our new offering. Next slide, please. Before we get into the overview of the Quick Guide, I'll quickly point out our adherence to the GEMI Antitrust Guidelines, and in case you're not familiar with GEMI, briefly tell you a little bit about us. Then Bob will give you some background on the Quick Guide concept. Steve will give you an overview of the first Quick Guide on renewable and alternative energy. And finally, Steve Hellam will facilitate a Q&A. Next slide, please. On the screen, you'll see the GEMI Antitrust Guidelines. As with all GEMI meetings, the Antitrust Guidelines are in effect during this webinar. If at any time you feel the discussion is moving in a direction that might violate these guidelines, please speak up and we will immediately redirect the conversation. If you're taking notes, please include that the guidelines were reviewed at the beginning of the webinar. Next slide. Okay, now that the housekeeping elements are taken care of, what is GEMI? Next slide. The Global Environmental Management Initiative, or GEMI, is a member-driven non-advocacy organization with global and domestic recognition and exposure. It's made up of environmental leaders and professionals from recognized leading sustainability companies and regularly engages in open, honest dialogue in a safe environment. We have a growing library of over 30 solutions-based self-assessment tools, including the Quick Guides, all of which are available on our website, which is noted at the bottom of each slide. Next slide. 2015 will mark GEMI's 25th year, which is really quite a long time for an environmental organization. We've managed to stay relevant in this ever-changing field by staying true to our mission of business helping business achieve environmental sustainability excellence and focusing on the education of our members through discussion and hands-on problem solving, collaboration with other organizations to better understand and address the pressing issues of today and tomorrow, and the development of resources that provide guidance and solutions for all businesses looking to improve their sustainability efforts. Next slide. As an overview, if you're not familiar with our tools, the GEMI Solution Tools Matrix on our website provides a quick look at the many tools GEMI has available and serves as a how-to, where-to solution for businesses seeking guidance on addressing environmental sustainability issues. On the website, the matrix is interactive, and as you hover over each of these cover pages for the tools, a pop-up window will display the tool details, associated publications, and other related resources to the tool. Next slide. And if you are familiar with the tools and have used them in the past, please consider sharing your experience with us by applying for the GEMI Solution Excellence Award. The award is presented annually to any entity that demonstrates excellent environmental, social, and economic results through the innovative use of one or more GEMI tools. Applications are being accepted through September 15th and can be found on our website, again noted at the bottom of the slide. And next slide. And finally, if you like what you hear today and want to find out more, we're always interested in expanding our membership to broaden the experience and knowledge base of GEMI. We'd love to hear from you, and additional contact information will be available at the end of the webinar. Next slide. Again, thank you for your time this morning, and I'm going to turn things over to Bob Toy, our Communications Director, to introduce you to the GEMI Quick Guide, which is really what you guys are here to hear about. Bob, take it away.
Thanks, Lori. The Quick Guide concept is really one that came out of all of the experience of our companies and thinking through how we can help take our best practices and best learnings and provide those to others, not just in the private space, but also in the public space as well. So unfortunately, I'm traveling and not at a computer, so I'm going to assume that we're on page 11, which talks through the approach. We've gone through a process of identifying the topics of all of us, of what are the most relevant subjects to cover, and how can we address best practices and provide big picture insights, but also the small case studies to give you a glimpse into what we're talking about and what we've learned. And we'll share several of those case studies today. Our goal is rapid development for these quick guides, taking just a couple of months and pulling together a shorter deliverable. This one actually is a little bit longer than our goal, but there was so much to talk about in the renewable energy space. And our goal also is to make this a living document so that as the market changes or as conditions change, we'll reflect those here. And in this space in particular, there's just so much changing on an annual basis that we anticipate that there will be frequent changes going forward. And Lori talked about the broader GEMI Solution Tools Matrix. This approach is really to supplement and complement those longer, more involved tools so that we can be relevant for today's situations. The quote at the bottom is really our guiding force. What can we say that provides new insight, context, and understanding to propel the conversation on key topics? So on the next slide, identify where our first four focuses are for the quick guide. This one, renewable and alternative energy, and then talking of our companies themselves. How do we cultivate sustainability internally? How do we prepare for the next wave of change in environmental management? And how do we engage employees in sustainability? Each one of these has the ability to talk at a variety of levels. And so our goal is to identify what are the key topics that we need to focus on, and then what are the most successful practices in order to be successful. All right. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve Scarda, who's going to talk through this first guide, the renewable and alternative energy.
Thank you, Bob. This is Steve Scarda with Procter & Gamble. What I want to do is just kind of give you a brief overview of the different sections we included in the guide, and without going into the details of the guide, just give you a little bit of a preview for what you'll see in each of the different sections. So again, as Bob mentioned, this is really intended to be a reflection of what our member companies have learned throughout this journey. So for myself specifically, I came into this role about 3 years ago. It was 4 years ago that Procter & Gamble announced a goal to power our plants with 30% renewable energy by 2020. And when we announced that goal, we didn't exactly have a plan on how we were going to do that, but we wanted an aggressive goal for our company to shoot for. And I can say in those first couple of years, it was a pretty steep learning curve for those of us who weren't exposed to the renewable industry previously, as has been the case, as Bob mentioned, for many of our companies. And we've learned a great deal in the last few years. And so what we really tried to do is, without going into a lot of detail, just capture those key points of learning that we had in our journey. And so it's not intended to be a detailed guide that any company like us could pick up and go step by step through every single step you need to take in order to execute renewable energy for your specific companies, but it will help give you some of those really key learnings that'll get you pointed in the right direction, and that's what we really aim to do. As you can see, we've selected 7 technologies that we address. These are the ones that we've had the most experience with and felt like we could talk to most intelligently, and so that's why we picked those specific topics. The first topic, bioenergy, you can see this on the next slide, is a reflection of what we've learned in biomass. And so as you'll see in the guide, we talk about bioenergy in 3 different categories. There's the typical traditional biomass where combustion is used, but then we also touch on anaerobic digestion or biogas, and then we talk about synthetic gas. And so we just try to ground individuals on the different components of biomass. And then we give some kind of guidance on, if you want to consider a biomass or bioenergy project for your facility, where do you start? And it kind of gets into some of the considerations around feedstock and technologies, and just gives you a high view overview of that. Let's go to the next slide. So then following that, Smithfield provides some of what they have learned as they completed a biogas project. So as we mentioned, biogas is one of the components of bioenergy. They provide the background and history of one of their case studies, a project which they installed successfully at one of their sites in one document, and then in the specific guide itself, they review what they learned to be the key considerations when you are going to go into a biogas type project. Next slide. We recognize that each of our companies come to renewable energy from a different perspective. So in my role for Procter & Gamble, I'm specifically interested in technologies that I can use to help power my plants and really displace electricity that I buy from the grid, specifically if that grid is predominantly sourced from fossil fuels, as well as displace natural gas wherever possible. However, many of our member companies, their largest source of fuel is often transportation fuels, especially if you're in a business like FedEx. We also have member companies that are responsible for petroleum and producing liquid fuels. And so we have a section on biofuels that really grounds the reader on the basics of biofuels and just how to think about where biofuels fit in an overall renewable energy portfolio. Next slide. At Procter & Gamble, geothermal is not necessarily one of the technologies that is really predominant. And when I speak of geothermal, I'm referring to deep well geothermal, where you tap into a hot resource deep in the ground, not to be confused with ground source or shallow geothermal, where you use the earth as a heat sink. So we've had a couple of experiences in deep well geothermal, one that was very successful, and we share as a case study. But then we had another one that didn't go as well as we would have liked, and so what we've tried to share here is some of those watch-outs as well, and talk a little bit about the risks of a geothermal project, where you can eliminate or reduce the risk that might be present in geothermal, but then also understand where there are risks and what you can do to mitigate those risks. And so that's what we discussed in the geothermal section. Next slide. Solar and solar PV is one of the fastest growing technologies. Actually, it is the fastest growing technology, at least here in the U.S. And so this section provides an overview on the different execution approaches, as there's many different ways to execute a solar project, whether it be building, owning, and operating panels on your site, are going a route that many companies are going these days, which is to have a third party come in and own and operate panels on your property or your roof surfaces. We also provide just a really high view look at what the basic economics are on a solar project. So it doesn't provide a really detailed model that is necessary to do a full net present value analysis, but it does just ground you on the basics of what are the install costs, where can you get data on install costs, what do you typically see for revenue in return for those investments, and then how can you be thinking about just a simple payback on solar panels, and it really kind of grounds you on some of the basics that are required for a successful project. So there's a lot of helpful, useful information in that section. Next slide. Again, we have another section on, we talk about liquid transportation fuels and biofuels. Then we have a section that talks specifically to transportation and how different transportations are addressing liquid biofuels and renewable energy for their fleets. And so I think this will be very helpful to those companies who have a large percentage of their energy needs in transportation. Next slide. We do talk about wind. We talk both about on-site wind and off-site wind. Procter & Gamble specifically has installed a wind turbine at one of our facilities, so we share that as a case study. But we also talk about the shortfalls of just one turbine on site, especially when you have large energy needs, as we do at many of our sites, and talk about wind farms and what it might look like to participate in a wind farm via a power purchase agreement, and then some other kind of mechanisms to compete in wind. And we also just frame the reader on, again, just some of those real basic principles that need to be considered before you even attempt a wind project. So, for instance, a solar PV project you can execute almost anywhere. Germany, which has a very low solar resource, has more installed solar PV per capita than anywhere else. Wind, however, can't be installed just anywhere. You really, truly need high wind speeds in order to make a wind project viable, financially viable. And so those are the kinds of basics that we go over and really review with the reader to get them moving in the right direction. Next slide. All right, with that, I'll turn it over for some question and answers and discussion.
Thanks, Steve. This is Steve Hellum with GEMI, and again, let me add my thanks with the Lorries to all of you folks participating today. We have a number of questions, and if you're more than willing to put those in the Q&A slide or in a chat slot, or send those directly to the folks at 2 Degrees. And let's just start off with a couple of questions. One specifically relates to the whole area of deep thermal, and the question I think for all of you, but particularly I think for Steve, is how did you get the buy-in for using deep thermal from senior management? Basically, how did you build that business case? How did you make it work? Steve?
Sure, great question. And really, we actually have two different scenarios, and I think it looked very different on both projects. So the project that we talk about in the case study was actually pretty straightforward. We were lucky enough to have a site that was in the middle of several other geothermal wells. It's in China, and the wells that are surrounding the plant are used predominantly for winter heating. And so there was very low risk that if we drilled into the ground that we wouldn't find that same hot resource and have very good flow. What we talk about in the guide are some of the basics that you need for a good geothermal project: flow, a fluid, a high temperature. Once we were able to de-risk the project and recognize that we had a very well-known resource, a simple financial analysis and net present value analysis revealed that we had a very profitable project, a project that was well above our rate of return threshold. And so because the financials worked on that project and it was a low-risk project, getting leadership support to move forward with it was very easy. Again, the financials drove that. Our goal, as are many of our member companies, is to do renewable energy, but only do it where we can also benefit our shareholders. So trying to avoid at all costs, needing to do projects that would either put us into a lower rate of return threshold or paying a premium for energy. That we're trying to avoid that if at all possible. The other project that I referred to was quite a bit different. The resource was not nearly as well known, and so we had to make a choice in terms of how much money were we willing to invest to determine whether the resource could really produce for us or not. And that's a very uncomfortable position for leadership to be in, especially in a conservative company like P&G, and I'm sure as many of your companies are as well. In that particular instance, we were able to move forward with a significant amount of geothermal testing. There's lots of different tests that you can do to help understand the probability of success. Ultimately, you never really know until you dig a test well, and we eventually did dig a test well. And we were able to spend money on the unknown, some could say with a pretty significant level of risk, in large part because the business owner, our person that is responsible for that specific business, had a really strong passion for sustainability and renewable energy, and so they were able to make decisions that were maybe outside of the box a little bit versus your normal straight net present value analysis. So we chose to really lean forward on that project, and frankly didn't find results that we wanted, and so we still might go forward with that project at some point, but not right now. And so I guess the answer to the question is, it really varies. Ideally, it's a pure net present value analysis that highlights a profitable project. Other times there's a lot of risk, specifically as it relates to geothermal, and it requires a leadership that is willing to lean forward. And that is not, I don't see that in every single one of our businesses, but it does happen on occasion like it did in that particular example.
Very helpful. Let me push a little bit further in the context of the business value proposition. Bob Toy, in terms of your all's case study on fueling options, what were some of the challenges and opportunities you found there in terms of moving that process forward, or the communication of what that means when sometimes people don't necessarily think about major railroads having that kind of thought process?
Well, in that project, I was looking at a battery option that we tested thoroughly and ultimately found that it wasn't as successful as we had hoped from an operational standpoint, but it was very successful in terms of learning and really trying to explore the next generation with all the trials and how you go through that. The communication piece is such a challenge, and as much as you think that you are ahead of the game and everybody's on board, sometimes you don't anticipate all of the issues, and that then opens up conversations with many more people. If you aren't able to have the communications in the first place, you won't have a project, and then if you're struggling with that in the midst of that, then your project will really struggle. So there's nothing better than communication.
Well, Lori, you guys at FedEx are obviously leaders in the whole sustainability arena, and your case study on your fleet portfolio activities and some of the other things. You want to address that issue of business, the business proposition, and then kind of how you made those things happen?
Well, I guess we had looked at it starting in the early 2000s, before my time in this organization. But it was really always looking over the next hill. What's the next big thing? We saw rising fuel prices. Where can we go to mitigate the risks going forward? And it led to some work with EDF on the first commercial hybrids for delivery vehicles. Followed by then we really started pushing, knowing that we weren't going to get the economies of scales and things down to an affordable, scalable level for a fleet of our size. And then we began the lobbying process for fuel efficiency standards for commercial fleets. And that's probably where we've had, that's been one of the biggest driving forces for us, that we, as our group, said, okay, this is where we really need to step up. That helps to transform the industry, not just our fleets.
Great, thanks. I've got a question that says, are there any legal issues to consider when using or assessing third-party owner, installer, operators in the context of the broad brush of renewable energies and those activities? Anybody want to take that one on?
This is Steve. I can attempt to. We're actually embarking on a very large project. We're not ready to announce it yet, but I can tell you that it involves a third party that will build a very large operation on one of our sites. And so there certainly has been a significant amount of work by both parties to secure terms that are acceptable to both teams. I guess the question is really asking, what are those specific examples? Ones that come to mind are what will happen to the equipment at end of life, who will maintain ownership, what will happen in the event of one or other party causing damage, either our facility or our property or our folks to the third party, or the third party to our property. Those all need to be addressed. All of the risks associated with a project need to be called out. Who owns those? How will they be dealt with if they come up? So, I mean, I could go on and on. There's a pretty lengthy process to go through. Things like the solar industry, they've gotten very good at that, and they have some standard terms and conditions that they find work well with most large companies as well as small companies. In other projects that are fairly custom or maybe not just your standard off-the-shelf project, it does require a significant amount of legal work to get terms that both companies can agree to. I don't know if others have more to add to that, but that's my initial reaction.
Any other comments, either Lori or Bob, on that one? Here's a question that focuses on renewables and the way it helps meet your carbon disclosure reporting requirements. If indeed the utility, there's always a challenge, if the utility takes the credits for the funding incentives, can they still be used on your reduction reporting?
That's an excellent question. Yeah, I'll start and then others can chime in. Excellent question, very smart question. That's one of those big points that we learned very early on in our journey, and that is a lot of the financing methods for several of these projects, and this is specifically true for solar PV, requires that the renewable energy credit, or the REC, be sold to a utility in states where there's a renewable portfolio standard. Because that renewable energy credit carries such a high value, it is sold to the utility and used as part of the financing for the project. When that happens, the owner, even if you're buying the electrons from those solar panels, because that renewable energy credit is sold to the utility, you cannot claim that you are powering your facility. And so that's been an important consideration for us when we look at new projects. Similarly, if we're outside of the U.S. and we're taking advantage of a feed-in tariff, most, but not all, but most of those feed-in tariffs require that the ownership of the environmental attributes, or again, the legal right to claim that you're using that energy is moved to the grid because of the feed-in tariff. And so the wind project that I gave you as an example takes advantage of the feed-in tariff, and then what we do is we go back and buy the renewable energy credits back so we can claim that legitimately that wind turbine is powering our plant. But it's a very important issue, to maintaining who owns the legal right to claim ownership of that power.
Steve, this is Bob. I want to add that question is one of a whole host, and what's nice about the quick guide is that we work through many of the choices, decisions that people need to think through. I don't think you have to spend gobs and gobs of money to get the best insights, but you need to make sure that you're thinking through all of the pieces. Besides just this part, there's also the financial aspect of what's the company's ROI requirements and hurdle rates and so forth. What does this mean for reputation, and what does it mean also for engagement within your company in terms of showing that you care about these topics? There's a lot to evaluate.
Laura, you want to add anything there?
No, I think I've covered it pretty well. Thanks.
Okay. Another question. Are certain sectors adopting particular technologies? I mean, we're lucky in GEMI in that we have a number of companies from across business sectors, but as you all look at your work collectively, are there certain sectors that seem to be attracted towards certain technologies?
Yeah, I think that is in large part dependent on the goals of a particular company and the energy needs of a company. So I can speak for P&G and say that we have a renewable energy goal, meaning both electricity and thermal. And so 75% of, or I think it's like two-thirds of most industrial users, two-thirds of their energy usage is typically thermal. And so if you have a goal to also green or make renewable your thermal energy as well as your electrical energy, that can sway which technologies you look at. Because I can't displace natural gas with wind. Frankly, I find solar PV projects to be excellent at demonstrating our commitment to renewable energy. However, they, as we mentioned previously, more often than not, the renewable energy credits are sold as part of the financing plan, and so they actually, I find, have a difficult time really putting large numbers against, as we're trying to get to 30%, a 1 megawatt solar project is, that runs 20% of the time actually has a pretty small impact. So for me particularly, we're really interested in those technologies that can take a big chunk out of our thermal energy. Bioenergy is definitely something that we gravitate towards. We want a diverse portfolio of all technologies, and so we are doing many solar projects, wind projects, geothermal projects. But as I look for the big bang for the buck, knowing that we have a lot of thermal energy that we'd like to displace, bioenergy can really move the needle forward in a large way, and that's just our perspective. I know the other companies think differently about that because their energy needs are different.
Well, here's one. All of you have been in the environmental sustainability world for a number of years. Are you a little bit surprised at how much industry and business has driven toward renewable energy? I mean, there was a time when nobody would talk about it, but it just, obviously from the standpoint of GEMI's increased interest in renewables and companies that are now making commitments in the context of renewables, are any of you pleasantly surprised by the focus, and what do you think is driving that increased focus?
This is Steve again. I can start by saying I've done a benchmarking study of 25 companies that do business in the same space as P&G, and what I found was that across the boards, most, not all, but most of the companies, at least 3/4 of them, had fairly aggressive CO2 goals. And I was, of course, very happy to see that. I think our industry really is leading the way within that regards. And those are all voluntary goals. They're not mandated. They're just doing the right thing. But as it speaks to renewable energy, one of the things that I noticed was that the companies that were having the most success in their carbon reduction, those that are really leading the way at the top of the group, are also those companies that are moving forward with large amounts of renewable energy. Renewable energy can be a very successful carbon reduction strategy, and when I looked at the results of these 25 companies, the ones, again, that had the best results were those ones moving towards with renewable energy. So, I mean, overall, I'm very proud of the fact that our groups and the companies that help write the guide are all very committed to renewable energy. And I think collectively we would say that when you talk about sustainable business strategies, having a sustainable energy supply long term is important to us from a risk mitigation standpoint, as well as meeting our carbon intensity goals. Lori, Bob, or others, you have comments?
Well, we're in the midst of our materiality assessment for GRI, and with the, we've been at the sustainability game for 20, 30 years. Being a transportation company, we don't, that's obviously we're contributors to carbon emissions, so we're doing what we can. But I think one thing that has been not necessarily surprising for those of us on the environmental management team, but perhaps as we share the results of the materiality assessment with our Enterprise Sustainability Council, is the increase in the stakeholders who are really, demanding it or expecting or demanding it of us. And I think that is going to go a long way internally to help us continue to drive our programs forward.
Great comments. Bob, you want to add anything, sir?
I think you have a confluence of a whole bunch of aspects here. You've got the external interest and conversation. You also have an improvement in capabilities of the technology, and then as a result of maybe both of those, you're seeing that prices come down that makes it more affordable, or at least something that becomes a better business proposition. So it's a nice combination of all of those that I don't know if surprising would be the word that I would use. I think it's just the fundamentals of business at work.
Excellent. Here's another question. Here's one with regard to ISO 50001. Are renewables part of ISO 50001, the whole energy management plans, and are the investments in efficiency reduced by these more high-profile projects? Who wants to take that one on? I guess first things first. Are we aware of whether or not ISO 50001 are renewables part of 50001?
This is Steve. We don't have a lot of experience with ISO 50001. I know a few of our sites in Europe where they have mandates incentives to follow that program or following it. But I just don't have enough experience to really comment on that specific question because we're not doing a lot in that space right now.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I would echo that.
Go ahead, Lori. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say I would echo Steve's comments. I don't have a lot of experience in that either.
The question about investments and efficiency being reduced is a good one, though. And I think it's important to point out, and this is in the guide, even though we focus the guide on renewable energy, conservation is still always, I'm pretty certain I speak for all the companies that contributed to it, and it is written in the guide that conservation is still our top priority. That's the first thing that we go after in every instance. And so our renewable energy work is not in any way limiting the investment that we continue to make in efficiency. It's really efficiency first, and then renewable energy on the energy that we're unable to eliminate. So first, try and reduce our energy consumption, and then once we have it reduced as far as we can go, then work on making it renewable.
Okay, I'll just remind you folks on the phone that if you have a question, please go ahead and ship it into us either in the chat or the Q&A section. Here's one that someone came in on the call late, and it's probably directed to you, Bob, in the context of you had said earlier, but maybe some other people missed it, that this is the first of a series of these quick guide tools. Do you want to just kind of come back and share with the folks what the other tools that are coming down the pike are, and maybe what the time frames are on some of those?
Sure. So our objective is to pull together insights from our member companies that we think will be relevant for others to adopt or at least be aware of and manage their strategies. So our focuses include cultivating sustainability internally, meaning how do you get people on board and engaged, and then somewhat related to that is employee engagement. What are the practical steps to get people on board? We'll also be bringing in a look at the longer-term environmental changes in the landscape, both from a threat and from a opportunity standpoint, and how you address those.
Great, thanks. Here's a question that we at GEMI, I mean, we don't. As Lori had mentioned up front, GEMI's not an advocacy organization per se, but here's a question that says, what limits do you see with regards to U.S. legislation compared to that in the EU with regard to renewables? Does anyone want to take that one on? I think we've been put on the spot. How about we change that a little bit? Maybe in the context. How about a trends question versus asking about legislation, and the potential in terms of the trends of what is happening in Europe as that comes back to the States, either in various kinds of policy determinations or actions by you global companies. Do you see a difference in what's going on in Europe with regard to renewables, and more from maybe an almost legislative or regulatory perspective? But are you seeing those trend lines coming back to the States from Europe on renewables?
This is Steve. I'll try and take a crack at that a little bit. I think a lot of our companies, or at least P&G specifically, tends to stay neutral on most policy as it relates to energy, or when and where we do influence, we influence through our trade groups typically, and so we don't take a lot of public positions on that. But I do think that one of the interesting things that we've learned as we've gone into renewable energy, and this is maybe stating the obvious, but incentives are always designed to be just enough to get business flowing, right? So they're usually designed to give just barely the rate of return to get industry moving forward. When you look at the profile of a lot of our businesses, speaking specifically to GEMI member companies, as well as many of the participants on the phone, our financial criteria for what we consider to be a successful project is usually above those thresholds. And so what we see in the incentive markets is as costs come down, so for instance, solar costs have come down, the incentives are designed specifically to, as the project costs come down and the rate of return starts to get better, the incentives come down as well, which they should. But the challenge that we're always facing is that rate of return hurdle is always, I shouldn't say always, but quite often still below our rate of return threshold. And so at least for us, that we find that that reiterates the importance of having third parties that we can work with. We find that a lot of times our strength, and I'm getting a little bit off topic here, but our strength is we can provide long-term, credible offtake agreements to third parties that need that for their financing. And so because of the way that incentive mechanism keeps the rate of returns low on purpose, that sometimes that requires a third party that's happy with that lower rate of return, but also in need of a large creditworthy offtake agreement, and that's where we can always come in.
Good. Bob, Lori, comments about that?
I know with regards to the EU, we've actually taken some of the requirements there to pilot some of our programs that can then be deployed around the world, or in our reporting of customer requirements, or how CO2 can be reported to customers. In France, the regulations around it are becoming more strict, so we're using that to help refine our carbon calculator that's available to customers around the world. So we're able to take what could be a challenge and turn it into an opportunity to broaden what our services are and how we tackle our transportation issues.
Great. Bob, any thoughts, comments on that?
Nothing to add, thanks.
Okay. All right. Here's another question, and Lori, I think it's probably been raised in the context of your comment about your supply chain impacts as well as third-party impacts. One of those, of course, is third-party impacts, as you were just talking about. As it relates to supply chain, are you all seeing increased interest both up and down your supply chains in renewable activity? And are some of those, let's see what it says here, some of the supply chain companies, some of the companies in your supply chain actually coming to you to learn and pick up on your own insights, et cetera? Or is it becoming increasingly something where you have more of a collaborative discussion going on with your supply chain?
I'd say over the past 3 or 4 years, it's been a pretty steady trend of companies coming to us and wanting more and more information about what we're doing and how we can help. One of the things we're looking to more now than we have in the past is how we can further partner with our customers to work on sustainability solutions together versus, this is what we have. Does it fit into your overall picture? More proactively looking at our different modes of transportation and what it can do to improve customer footprints and that sort of thing.
Great. Steve, comments on that?
No, I don't think I have anything additional to add on that one.
Okay. Bob, you want to add anything on that one in terms of supply chains or third-party influences on renewables, et cetera?
I would echo Lori's comments that there's a steady conversation, but it tends not to be in this space. For us, our energy consumption that's outside of our locomotive operations is relatively small. So I think that there are other companies like P&G that could teach people much more on that specific topic.
Okay, excellent. Let's see. We just about those are pretty much the questions that we've gotten from you all participating. And I think on this note, since we're kind of coming to the closely to the end of our hour, but we haven't used the whole hour, that I think I'm going to turn Lori, turn it back to you. But on behalf of GEMI, I just want to thank Lori and Steve and Bob for doing this morning, and importantly thank the 2-degree team for hosting and working with us to get this information out. So thank you very much, and Lori, I'll turn it back to you.
All right, thanks, Steve. Lots of Steves going on in this conversation today. So I think there is one more slide here that does have information for all of you as to where you can access the quick guide and how you can get in contact with us at GEMI. If there's any additional information that you'd like around the guides or around the organization or around any of the tools that we produce, we'd be happy to hear from you. Again, I'll put the plug in. If you have ever used one of the GEMI tools in the past, please take a look at the application for the Solution Excellence Award. And I'd like to thank Stephen for allowing us an hour today and for setting up this webinar with everybody. I hope you guys found it useful, and we'll go out and visit the site and take a look at the quick guide and let us know what you think. Again, thanks for your time, and I will turn it back over to Stephen if there's anything that you need to close things up.
Great. Thank you very much, Laurie. No, that's it. But just to remind everybody that a recording of this webinar and also the presentation slides will be archived on the 2 Degree platform. And as soon as those go live, I'll send out an email to everybody with the links to that. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us today. I hope you found it useful and interesting, and you'll be able to join us for future webinars in the coming months. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.